Greetings everyone, my name is Michael McCann, and welcome to another Wayward Art Company video. In this one we're going to be creating this procedural wood texture, but we'll also be doing some material studies. This is when you look at the different attributes of a material, and in this case we'll be trying to replicate those with procedural textures. So I'll start by going into Blender, and deleting the default cube, and now I'll type Shift A and add a plane. This will just sort of act as the canvas so that we can view our procedural texture. Now I'll split the screen because of course we'll need to open up the shader editor. Now I'll add a new material. And I'll also, in the 3D viewport, I'll go into rendered view. Now, regardless of what type of wood material you're making, I find it always best to start with a wave texture. Now, if we view this texture, we'll see that we just have these simple lines. But we can quickly turn this into a wood grain pattern. I'll use Control T to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. This is because I have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. And to start creating this wood grain pattern, I'm going to take the distortion up very high to a value of 50. I'll take the detail all the way up to a value of 15, which is its max value. And then the detail scale down to a 0.5. And to get this looking more like wood grain, let's use the mapping node to scale this on the x-axis. I'll scale the x to a 5, and to stretch that out a little more, I'll take the y value down to a 0.5. And it's already looking quite a bit more like wood grain. So I will also switch the texture coordinate from generated to UV. Now let's take a look at some images of wood. We see that we have this wood grain pattern, but we also have these wood knots. And the wood grain pattern appears to conform around them. One of the most powerful tools in creating a procedural texture is using a variety of different methods to how you map them. So I'll type Shift A and I'll add a Voronoi texture. And I'll add this to the viewer and then also add a color ramp. Now I want to flip the direction of this color ramp. And then I want to pull this black value back until I get these little round circles. And if I just plug this into the vector input on that wave texture, you can see that we are driving the texture coordinates of one texture with another texture, which is very cool. Of course, it looks terrible, but we can mix these values. So let me add a mapping and texture coordinate node to the Voronoi texture as well. And we'll just use the one texture coordinate node because everything that we add will be UV coordinates. So in order to create these wood knots, I'm just going to mix the mapping node with the color ramp that's connected to that Voronoi texture. So we'll add a mix RGB node. We can see already something has happened. Let's expand this node and we'll switch it from mix to difference. And we'll leave it at a value of 0.5 for now. And when using one texture to drive the coordinates of another texture, it will blend better if the texture is softer. So if I switch from F1 to smooth F1, you can see the difference here. It's much softer. And on the color ramp, we can switch from linear to ease. And you can see also there that that blends much more nicely. Now, looking at various photographs of wood knots, I could see that they are very often stretched in one direction. So they're not completely circular, they're more oval. So on the mapping node connected to the Voronoi texture, I'm going to scale the X value. And I think a value of 2.5 looks pretty good. But you can see how this wood grain now comes up and wraps around these wood knots, which I think looks very natural. We can also control the amount of distortion around these wood knots, but first let's take a look at this color ramp. After softening up that Voronoi texture, you can see that some of these wood knots are connected. So I'm going to drive this black back a little bit, just between this drop-down menu and the subtraction sign there. I think is pretty good. So now most of them are separated. But they all typically have the same shape. So in order to add a little bit of a random distortion, I'm going to type Shift A and add a noise texture. Then I'll plug in the UV coordinates. And then I'll mix it with this mapping node. Now instead of mix, we're going to switch this to linear light and set the value really low to something like a 0.02, which doesn't really show much of a difference. But if you start to increase the scale of the noise texture, you'll start to see some of that distortion. And I'll just set the scale of that noise to a nice even value of 10. And that should give each one of these wood knots a nice random shape. Now, I mentioned before about controlling the amount of distortion around these wood knots. And if we take another glance at our first wood reference, we can see that that wood grain does really expand quite drastically around those wood knots. So if I select the color ramp and type Control-Shift-D, I can duplicate it while keeping it connected to the Voronoi texture. Now let's connect this to a viewer, and we'll switch it from ease to B-spline. We can see the nice gradient around this now. So if I connect both of these color ramps with a Mix RGB node, we can combine them, but I don't want to leave this as Mix either. I want to set it to something like Add or maybe Screen. Let's try Screen. And what we have now is the ability to control the distortion around these wood knots by just controlling that black value. And we can also just control the size of the wood knots separately. For now, I'll leave the first color ramp alone and just slide this black slider on the second color ramp back a little bit just to expand that distortion. We can always later change the size of the wood knot if we choose, but for now I'm just getting the general shape that I like. And we've already done quite a lot with a relatively small amount of nodes, I think. One of the things I love about this material is that it's not overly complicated with lots of math nodes. It's relatively straightforward and doesn't use a ton of nodes at the end. But let's take a look at this wood grain again, and then we'll look at another wood reference. We can see this sort of brushy, hair-like pattern in the wood grain. And there's a really easy way of replicating that. If we type Shift-A and add a Musgrave texture, and take a look at it, we can see that Musgrave is basically just a highly contrasted sort of Perlin noise. But if we use the same mapping as the wave texture, you can see now that we've elongated it and it's mapped around those wood knots. So we can adjust the scale. I'll set it to a 7, take the detail all the way up to 15, and the dimension all the way down to 0. What we have now is sort of this brushy pattern. So if I combine these two textures with a Mix RGB, and we'll switch this from Mix to Linear Light as well, and I'll take it all the way down so that when we increase it, we'll start to see the difference. I'll just increase it until I see something that I like. So a value of 0.2 I think looks pretty good. It's a rather small detail, but that's part of what material studies is. Oftentimes it's the little details that make all the difference. Okay, so now that we've added a number of textures, one of the things that we can do to make life a little easier is to add the ability to scale everything at once. So if I type Shift-A and go to Converter and then Vector Math, and I'll switch this from Add to Scale, this gives us the option to scale all of those additional elements together rather than having to do it separately. This is, of course, also the reason that I'm using one texture coordinate node versus several, because this, of course, will only work if everything's plugged into the same one. So I want to keep everything nice and separate for now. So this is what's generating that wood knot shape, and this is for the wood grain. I'll just separate these, and I think we can start working on the color of the material. To do that, I'm going to type Shift-A and go to Converter and add a color ramp. There's a very easy way of adding multiple colors to a material by sampling them from an image. But your base needs a lot of range of value, so it can't just be black and white. So our procedural texture already has some value in it. So if I go to the image editor, I'm going to open an image of wood that I have already loaded into Blender. I like this one because it has a variety of different ranges of colors and values. So I can just sample from different areas around the texture and see which color palette I like best for this wood material. But I think I'm going to stick with this sort of brown area up here in the corner. I really like this region because it's nice and evenly spaced out with light and dark values. So I think I might try to sample from here. To do that is very easy. I'll click on the drop down on the color ramp and choose Eyedropper. Now in the image, I'll just click and drag across, and then when I come back to the color ramp, all of those pixel colors that I've dragged the eyedropper across will be added. Okay, and this looks perfectly fine, but if you feel like it looks a little flat, one thing that you can do to add some contrast is to just go to your color ramp, and on one end, just lighten the value, and on the other side, we'll darken it. And just as a personal preference, I like this better. Then of course you can always come in and fine tune the colors if you wish, or there's some options right on the color ramp, like you can distribute the stops evenly, which just spaces out all those value, and you can also flip the color ramp to essentially flip the wood grain. However, I think I'm going to flip that back. I like it the other way better. And I might also dull out this, I think that the light color on the end is a bit too bright. Okay, so that looks better. You can also change the blend type to something like ease or B-spline if you want to spread those values out. And that'll just be the base of our color. We are going to add some more detail. First, let me come over to the 3D viewport and turn off the overlays. I sometimes get distracted if I'm just staring at the 3D cursor. Okay, so next I'm going to duplicate this Musgrave texture. I'll type Control-Shift-D to keep it connected to the mapping. And so let's view this. All I'm really going to do is take the scale back down to a value of 5, just to change the pattern. Okay, now instead of viewing the color from the shader, let's view it from the color ramp. And I'll add a mix RGB node. And then I'll switch the mix type to overlay. And this Musgrave texture will now be the mix factor. And from here, all I need to do is change the color. So I'm going to select sort of a bluish gray color. Now this is really just an artistic decision, but I did get this a little bit from the reference image, which we'll take a look at in a moment. But now you have the option to scale this variation. Okay, so we can reconnect this to the principled shader. And one other thing I'd like to do is change the color of these wood knots. So I can just duplicate this mix RGB node. And I'll keep it at overlay. But this time for the mix factor, I want to use this first color ramp, which separates our wood knots. So that'll be plugged into the factor. And now I want to change the second color input to something like a dull orange color. We can make this even more pronounced if we type Shift-A and go to Converter and add a math node and add it right into the mix factor. And I'll switch this to multiply, and I'll take the value up, and let's just set it to a value of 3. Okay, so now it's a little more visible when you change the color of those wood knots. Okay, so this is coming along. I like the shape of our wood pattern. I like the colors we've added so far. It still needs some details, which we'll add in a moment, but first let's take a look at this reference image. You can see the wood knot appears to be that sort of dull orange color. And this bluish gray comes from this surface dirt, which looks sort of ashy, or that grayish blue in certain areas. So it's part of why I chose it. I also just really like the color contrast. And let's take a look at this wood knot. You can see this really dark line around. That part of that is a gap between the wood and the wood knot, but it also seems to extend outwards. And we also have this crack right in the center of the wood knot. So, continuing with this concept of material studies, let's see if we can replicate that. So let's use Control-Shift-D to duplicate this first color ramp, and we'll add it to the viewer. Okay, and this doesn't really need a soft edge, so we'll switch this from ease back to linear. Next, I'm going to select the white marker all the way to the left, and then click on Add, which will add another white marker, although we need to make that pure white. And also I'm moving it to the right side of the black marker. Okay, so now let's add this to our material's color. So what I'll do is I'll just duplicate this mix RGB node, and I'll switch the mix type to, let's see, I'll switch it from overlay to multiply. And now I'll plug the color ramp right into the second color input of that node. Okay, so let's increase the value all the way to 1. And if we go back to the color ramp, you'll see that the right marker will affect that blend on the outside of that border. The black marker will actually affect the size. So we can just adjust the size to what we want, just to fit the size of the wood knots. And then the left marker will basically blend the inside of that edge. Okay, so I'll pull that inside blend pretty close to the black marker and let the outside have a little more of a softer blend. And you'll notice that sometimes you'll have this, like these two wood knots, for instance, are very close together. And you can tinker with this if you wanted to separate them. But I won't bother because that's not a very common occurrence to see those two grouped together. Okay, so next we're going to work on the cracks in the center of those wood knots. And part of material studies is to constantly be looking at reference images. So there's a few here to look at, and while the cracks can be rather chaotic and elaborate, oftentimes they form almost a perfect cross pattern. And that's an exceptionally easy thing to do. Let's duplicate this Voronoi texture with Control-Shift-D so that it stays connected to the mapping. And we'll add it to the viewer. And we'll switch from Euclidean to Minkowski. And just like that, we have the crack pattern that we're looking for. And if we add a color ramp, without even making any adjustments at all, it will immediately reduce the size of those cracks. Now we have this black marker to the left, which will intensify the darker values from the inside out. And then the white marker will affect the lighter values from the outside in. So we can essentially change the thickness of these cracks and the size. And what I want to be able to do now is to control the distortion of those cracks separately. So if I select this noise texture and this mix RGB, and I'll just duplicate them with Shift D, and I want them to keep the same connections as the nodes above. So the mapping node needs to be connected to the mix RGB node, and the vector math needs to be connected to the noise texture. Now, while the original noise texture and mix RGB will connect the distortion of those wood knots, these will just affect the wood cracks. And we can use the detail or the roughness to affect it, but ultimately the best result will come from just the scale of that noise texture. I'll just set it to a nice round number like 40. Alright, so let's add this to the material color. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to combine these two color ramps with a mix RGB node. So I'll set the mix type to multiply. So what we have is the rings around those wood knots and then the cracks in the center. And if we take a look at this node now and we increase the value to 1, we can see that we have the border of those wood knots with the cracks in the center. So this will already be connected now to our color map. So let's view this through the principled shader. Okay, so at first glance, all of the attributes of this material that we've added are there. I do think that the border around those wood knots is a bit too dark, but I rather like the value of the wood cracks in the center. But because both of them are connected to the same mix RGB node, if we were to decrease the value of that multiply mix RGB node, we would be decreasing the effect of both of them. So instead, what I will do is go back to the color ramp that's affecting the border of those wood knots and just change the value from black to something like a lighter gray. And this, by the way, is 100% an artistic decision. It has nothing to do with, I mean, it almost contradicts what we saw in our reference images and in our material studies. But there should be a balance between the two. You know, you should have your own artistic say in what your final material looks like. And for that matter, if you're following along with this tutorial, you should be experimenting with all of these values. Because you may in fact find things that you prefer better than the material that I've created. So, you know, that's ultimately what art is creating something that you find pleasing and that you believe will inspire others. Now, one last thing that we can view from these reference images are these fine wood cracks. Now, these do seem to be quite random, but they do seem to take into consideration the wood knots in that they conform around them. And creating these little surface cracks is just as simple as it was creating the cracks for the wood knots. In fact, we'll even use the same nodes. We'll select this Voronoi texture and the color ramp, and we'll just duplicate these with Shift D, and we'll move them over. Let's move them over to the space where we've created our wood grain, and we'll use the same mapping. Now let's view the color ramp. Alright, and we also want to scale these wood cracks. So we'll type Shift A and go to Vector and choose a mapping node, and we'll just drop this right into the line. And we will scale the Y to a value that's pretty small, like a 0.2. And the X to something a bit larger, like a value of 5. Okay, but our cracks aren't very visible yet, so we can go back to the color ramp and move the white marker all the way down and the black marker all the way down as well until we start to see those cracks appear. We can also increase the scale of the Voronoi texture to make those cracks much smaller. I think a value of 15 looks pretty good. Although you can always change this if you wish to increase or decrease the size of these cracks. It's as simple as just adjusting the scale of that Voronoi texture. Okay, I'm just going to box select everything and move it back to make some room. And then I'll duplicate this Mix RGB node with Shift D. It's already set to multiply, so I can just connect this color ramp that defines the wood cracks. And I think the material color is done. I think it looks pretty good. One last thing that I think I'll do for the color, it's something that I typically do for all material shaders that I create, is I just want to be able to control the overall value. So if I type Shift A and go to color and add a gamma node, now we'll just have this one slider that will control the darkness or the brightness of that wood. Okay, now that the color is done, we can move on to some of the really fun stuff, which is the height information and the material roughness. And we'll work on the bump detail first and then move on to the glossiness or roughness detail. So back in the shader editor, I'll type Shift A and go to Vector and then add a bump node. And I'll plug the normal output into the normal input on the principled shader. And the node that's going to provide most of the height information or the bump detail is the very first node that we added, which was that wave texture. Let's plug that right into the height input on the bump node. Okay, and you can see that it's really quite intense. But rather than just lowering the strength on the bump node, let's try to smooth it out with a math node. So I'll type Shift A and go to Converter and choose Math. And I'll just drop it right into the line leading into the height input. And now I'll switch the type, the math type, from add to divide. And I've already experimented with a value for the second input, and I find that a value of 600 works really well. Okay, so now that bump detail is a lot smoother and considerably more realistic. But if we view this math node, we can see that the values are very dark. And you never really want that with bump detail. You want something with a more mid-ranged value. So let's type Shift A and add a color mix RGB node. We'll just drop it right into the line, but I don't want this connected to the first input. I actually want it connected to the second input. And I'll switch the mix type to add. Now I'm just going to change the color of that first input to a really dark gray. Okay, and I'll also increase the value to 1. So what we have now is this very mid-ranged value. So we can essentially still add or subtract height information because everything's relatively neutral. Let's just move everything back to make some space for more nodes. I'll just duplicate this mix RGB node. And I'll switch this from add to multiply. And for the mix factor, I'm going to use this multiply math node that intensified the contrast of those wood knots. So I'll plug that into the mix factor. And now if we view this node, we can see that we have these really dark wood knots that can be intensified just by changing the value of that second color input. Okay, so now I'll duplicate this node with Shift D, and I'll just move it up. And I want to add all of those cracks. So this color ramp has the fine wood cracks. So I'll connect this to the first input. And then we have our color ramp that defines our wood knot cracks. So I'll plug that into the second input, and it's already set to multiply. So if we view this node, we can see that they are combined. And to add this detail to the height information, all we need to do is duplicate this mix RGB node again with Shift D and drop it in. Although that's the wrong connection, so we'll disconnect this. And we'll just connect the previous mix RGB node to the first input. And the mix RGB node that's combining those cracks will go into the second input. Okay, so now if we view this material through the principled shader, we should see all of those cracks visible with the bump detail. Okay, and I think that's looking pretty nice. What I'm going to do though is disconnect this bump because my computer is really starting to lag. And I don't want it to be very slow while we're working on the roughness or specularity of this material. So let me just separate some of these different elements, and that will give us some space to work on the material's roughness. And rather than using an already existing texture node for the roughness base, I'm going to add a new one instead. So I'll type Shift A and go to Texture and add another Musgrave texture. And for the vector input, we're going to use the same mapping that we've used for all of the other Musgrave textures. And we'll just plug that in, and we'll start to see that Musgrave texture take the same shape as our wood material. Okay, now let's take the detail up to 15 and the dimension down to 0. And I want to switch this type to multifractal. This creates a larger range of value, which is pretty essential in creating a roughness map. But I would like to even out these values slightly, so I'll type Shift A and go to Color and then add a Brightness Contrast node. I'll take the brightness up to about a 0.4 and then the contrast down to a -0.8. Okay, and I want some more random roughness added to this, so I'll type Shift A and add a Color Mix RGB node. And I'll switch the mix type to difference. And for the second color input, I want to add a noise texture. But rather than add a new one, we already have these two noise textures that we added previously. This one controls the distortion for the cracks in the wood knots, and this one for the distortion of the wood knots themselves. This is the one that I want to add to that second color input. And now if we view this node, let's zoom in a little more. Let's also increase the value to 1. We can see that we have this variation in the surface roughness, and we can control that with this slider. And one last thing I would like to do is remove the glossiness from those cracks, because they are cracks and they shouldn't reflect any light. So let's move these nodes back. And I'll duplicate this Mix RGB node and just move it down. And I'll switch this from Difference to Add. And in the first input, I will add this color ramp, which is those fine wood cracks. But I need to invert it, so I'll type Shift A and add a Color invert. And for the second input, I'm going to just add the wood knot cracks. So from this color ramp. And I also need to invert that as well. So I'll just duplicate this node and drop it into that second line. And if I view this, now you can see all of those cracks are a bright white value. So that means that there will be no glossy reflection. So let's duplicate this mix RGB node again. We'll plug the first mix RGB node into the first input and the second one into the second input. And now we have removed all of the glossiness from those cracks. And I think that's probably all we're going to do for the roughness map. Let's just plug this into the roughness input on the principled shader and see how that looks. Okay, so we have this nice roughness on the wood surface, plus it's removed all of the roughness from those cracks. And now we have our very realistic but also stylized wood material that's relatively simple and straightforward compared to many material shaders. Let me know what you guys think of these material study videos. Personally, it's a subject I really enjoy. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and also subscribe to the channel, and even share it with your artist friends. See you in the next one, guys. Thanks for watching.